Greetings, everyone. I'm Barbara Kaufman, and my fellow League of Women Voters board member in the Portland area is Peg Beleno. And we're delighted to sponsor this, and we want to thank you and welcome you to the Gray Library, Public Library. And I just want to give you a little heads up that the League is a 102-year-old nonpartisan organization that never supports or opposes any political party or candidates. We do, however, care deeply about elections and voting, so we're really pleased to sponsor tonight's event with Secretary of State Shenna Bellows about election integrity. And there she is. Before we start, we've got some logistics and details. You step out the door and turn right, you'll find the bathrooms. But we are live here, and we're also live streaming on GCTV, so many initials. After the event, a recording will be replayed on weekends on GCTV2 and on NGTV3 in New Gloucester. A video link will also be available on the League's Facebook page and the Portland Area League's webpage. And if you look at the orange poster, you will see how you can get hold of a video of this event. And feel free to take a picture on your way out and spread the word. Secondly, the League of Women Voters of Maine also publishes vote411.org, a nonpartisan voter information source for municipal, legislative, and statewide races and referenda. And we have bookmarks and cards out on the table with more information. The Secretary of State's website is also a wonderful resource for elections. And please check out the list on the white pieces of paper to find nonpartisan resources. Thirdly, we have some basic ground rules posted for this evening, and they are on yellow and green right here. Basically, everyone is invited to participate, speak and listen respectfully and civilly, keep questions clear and brief and on the index card, which you will have if you don't already. Tonight, Secretary of State Shenna Bellows will talk for about 20 minutes, and she would love to answer all your questions afterward. Just write them down on your index card, please, and we'll collect them and give them directly to her to respond. And now to the most important part. Our Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows, is Maine's 50th Secretary of State and the first female Secretary of State. Previously, she served as a state senator representing 11 cities and towns in southern Kennebec County. Prior to elected service, she served as executive director of the Maine Holocaust and Human Rights Center, ran a small consulting business, served as the executive director of the ACLU of Maine, and served in the AmeriCorps and Peace Corps. She served on the executive committee of the 2009 and 2012 ballot campaigns to pass marriage equality in Maine and co-chaired a successful 2011 statewide ballot campaign to restore same-day voter registration. She was an original member of the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting. Young Shenna Bellows grew up in Hancock, Maine, where she was a Brownie and a Girl Scout. She now resides in Manchester with her husband, Brandon, and their cats. Please take it away, Madam Secretary.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. As you were talking about my childhood in Hancock, I was thinking when I was a kid, I had a copy of the Bill of Rights on my bedroom wall. I love the Constitution. I loved it then. And now in my office as Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Charlie Summers had commissioned a very high quality copy of the Maine Constitution. And so I walk into my office every day and look at the Maine Constitution, which of course, as the chief election official for the state of Maine, I swear to uphold and defend. And democracy is fundamental to everything that we care about, everything at all. And I particularly appreciate working with the nonpartisan League of Women Voters over so many years The League of Women Voters has participated in nonpartisan advocacy campaigns, was a real leader in that 2011 same-day voter registration, and is a wonderful voice at the State House on elections issues, including election integrity, which is the topic of tonight's talk. Although I'm happy to talk about anything to do with elections because it's important. So we should be very proud in Maine. In 2020, more than 828,000 Mainers cast a ballot in the 2020 election. That made us third in the nation in voter participation. Colorado ranked second, Minnesota ranked first. We're coming for them. It is our goal to be number one in the future. Our elections are safe, they are accessible, they're accurate. We work very hard to make sure that every Maine citizen, 18 years or older, has the ability to register to vote, to cast a ballot, and know that their ballot will be counted accurately. And there are checks and balances safeguarding election integrity at every step of the way. So I'm going to start with voter registration, then I'm going to talk about the conduct of elections, and then I will talk about tabulation and certification. Voter registration. We are proud. We are actually one of only 2 states in the nation where no Maine citizen ever loses their right to vote for any reason. Maine and Vermont are the only 2 states in the country where every citizen of the state is able to vote. Maine citizens are required to show proof of residency and proof of identity. Sometimes people say, oh, we need a voter ID. And while we don't require that Maine voters show something at the polling place, we do require that they show that identity or prove their identity when they register to vote. And everyone must be registered to vote before they receive a ballot. Maine has same-day voter registration, meaning you can register to vote anytime. Earlier this week, we celebrated National Voter Registration Day because in many states, there are early deadlines for voter registration prior to the election. We see that as an artificial barrier because it blocks people who are working full-time, perhaps caring for family or loved ones or children. It blocks those people who may not be able to register by that deadline from participating on election day. In Maine, you could register to vote prior to election day or on election day. And there are 3 ways to do so. We have voter registration cards that we distribute. The League of Women Voters does a wonderful exercise at citizenship ceremonies for new Mainers, distributing those voter registration cards. And if you want to volunteer with the League, you should sign up afterward. You can download those voter registration cards off of the Secretary of State's website, fill that out, and mail that in at your convenience with proof of identity and proof of residency. You can go to your municipal office, your municipal clerk. Maine administers elections at the municipal level. And this is really important for folks who come to Maine from other states because out west, they administer elections at the county level. Think about that for a minute. You can cast your ballot sometimes in a particular place in the county, sometimes anywhere in that county. And the county might be administering the elections will be administering the elections for all of that offices in that county. In Maine, we do it at the town and city level. It's at the municipal level with more than 500 towns. So you can register to vote in your municipal town or city hall. Or just this year, thanks to the legislature and Governor Mills, you can use automatic voter registration at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Now, at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, we are already requiring proof of identity and proof of residency, as well as legal status, meaning citizenship or other legal status, in order to get your license or your ID. And so automatic voter registration means that if you're demonstrating that proof of citizenship from an original birth certificate or naturalization papers and your identity and your residency, we then at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles direct you through an electronic PIN pad to opt in to registering to vote. Your information gets sent to your municipal clerk or registrar, and you're on the voter rolls. I think it's a wonderful innovation. Now, Maine routinely conducts voter list maintenance. This is a key and foundational to election integrity. That means that we receive information about people who have passed away from vital records, all of the death certificate information. We receive notices of change of address from the U.S. Postal Service. And most recently, thank you to the efforts of Representative Patrick Corey of Windham, who introduced legislation to do this, Maine joined ERIC. It's called the Electronic Registration Information Center. It's a cooperative among states to exchange voter information. So if you've moved from Maine to Florida and you register to vote in Florida, we are now exchanging data with Florida, Arizona, and many other states across the country to capture that voter registration information and remove you from the rolls, because you very much have the option of calling your town clerk and saying, look, I'm moving, say, from Gray to Florida, although why would anybody do that? To remove yourself from the rolls. But most people don't. It's not something that's top of mind when they are moving. They're thinking about, moving their furniture, not necessarily ending their prior voter registration. So now, through participation in this interstate collaborative, we can capture that information and in that way conduct voter list maintenance. And finally, under federal law, there are prescribed procedures for removing individuals from the voter registration list by sending what's called an MVRA postcard to verify that the voter is living at that address. We have to do so in a non-discriminatory manner. We have to wait until at least 2 federal elections have passed in which they have not participated before we even send that postcard. But we are then permitted at the state level to do what's called an NVRA mailing to verify voter status and potentially inactivate voters in that way. So those are some of the ways in which we regularly conduct what we call voter list maintenance, making sure our voter registration rolls are as accurate and up to date as possible. And then finally, clerks and election workers at the state level routinely do work to identify duplicate records and eliminate duplicate records. If we see the same name in multiple municipalities, there's work that sometimes happens at the state level to identify those duplicates and make sure that people are registered in one municipality at a time. So that's voter registration and some of those safeguards to make sure that it's accessible to all, that every Maine citizen 18 years or older can register. And actually, side note, in Maine, we love our young people, right? We celebrate our youth. And in Maine, we did pass a law to allow 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. And we did that so that when they turn 18 on Election Day, which this year is November 8th, 2022, always the first Tuesday after the first Monday of the month in November, when they go on November 8th, they can and will be eligible to vote. We also do that to assist in the recruitment of poll workers, because to be a poll worker, you need to be a resident of the county in which you're volunteering, and you need to be registered or pre-registered to vote. We think getting those 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds to pre-register and then volunteer as a poll worker is a great exercise in civics and learning how your democracy works. So that's the process of voter registration. Now let's talk about the conduct of our elections and the election integrity measures built into our elections. First and foremost is paper. Maine has the gold standard in election security, and that is the paper ballot. That is a physical record of how people have voted, and it is something that can be reviewed in a recount or at any step of the process. Or an audit, which is something that under the leadership of Senator Nicole Grahowski, we will be moving forward with audits starting in 2023 for the 2024 and 2025 elections. Every ballot design is proofed for accuracy. Our election workers at the state level, just like workers at the local level, work in teams of 2. So there are 2 eyes on different aspects of the process. Ballot design is proof not only for accuracy, but tested with the tabulators to ensure that when ballots are scanned through tabulators, that the ballot is marked and scanned choices correctly. Federal and state laws require that ballots be stored securely by the clerks for a specific period of time. For federal elections, for the presidential, it's 22 months following the election for any further recounts or challenges in court. Now, this was a development in the late 1800s, but we have a secret ballot. So in the battle days, party bosses or employers or bullies could try to influence how people were voting because the ballot was not necessarily secret. But under the law, Americans, Mainers, have the right to keep your vote private. And you are under no obligation to ever tell anyone how you voted. Absentee ballots, the design of the fold of the absentee ballot is carefully conducted to specifically hide vote selections so that when volunteers are removing an absentee ballot from an envelope and putting them in groups, they are not immediately associating a voter selection with the name on the envelope. And then ballots are only unfolded in batches, in bunches, so that a volunteer wouldn't be able to say, oh, Mr. Jones voted for X and Mr. Smith voted for Y. Chain of custody is extraordinarily important. And Representative Teresa Pierce of Falmouth has been a huge leader on chain of custody for both ballots and election equipment. As a co-chair in appropriations, she was a fighter for funding for our elections and for election integrity. So Maine has very strong laws on the chain of custody of our equipments and of our ballots at every step of the way. So let's talk about, the conduct of election on election day. So when you walk into the polls, there are usually multiple people there. Maine, and there are always multiple people there. Not usually, always. Maine law requires that there be representatives from both major political parties as poll workers on election day. That means equal representation of Democrats and Republicans. Unenrolled voters, independent voters, Green Party members, libertarians are all encouraged to volunteer as well. But those poll workers who are greeting you cheerfully when you walk in to vote on election day are representative of both major political parties. And they have the voter participation list. They have a list of all of the voters who are registered to vote in that municipality. And when you walk in, you are asked your name and address, and you are checked off the list. Similarly, if you're voting absentee, there is a list that is being checked by your local election officials so that your name is being checked off as having requested a ballot or having returned a ballot. You're handed a ballot, you go into the booth, you mark your choices, you go out to the tabulator. The election tabulators in Maine are all with ES&S. That's the company that we use. It's a statewide lease so that all of the tabulators and all of the municipalities are uniform. The devices for those tabulators are programmed by the state and tested at the state level and at the local level. And they are never connected to the internet. Not wirelessly, not with a cord. The tabulators are never connected to the internet. So those who would do us harm, whether it's foreign adversaries or malicious actors at the domestic level, have no ability to hack into those machines either before or on election day or on election night when that count is happening. With vote counting, let's talk about the count for a minute. Has anybody ever been present when the ballots have been tabulated? I see a couple of hands. I see a few hands. So you are well aware that this is not one person in a back room. It's not your municipal clerk. As wonderful as your clerks are, thank you. Shout out to Gray and New Gloucester clerks. It is not your clerks by themselves in a back room. It is multiple paid election workers and observers from the political parties, from the candidates who are by law allowed to be in that room. And as we know historically in Maine, we're a purple state. We have close races time and time again at every level. And time again, both major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, are sending observers from the party and from the candidates into those rooms. They're not just doing it on election night. Under law, when the ballots are removed from envelopes for the absentee processing, the clerks publicize that to the parties and invite the parties to be present when those absentee ballots are being removed from the envelopes. They're not being counted before Election Day, but they're being processed. They're being removed and then safeguarded. There are eyes on every step of that process. Post-election checks. Now, you count the ballots, there are a lot of eyes there, they have the results, they call them into the newspapers, they post them on the wall so that everyone can see them. Candidates, representatives, I was a candidate for state senate. I had my observers in every single one of the towns in my state senate district calling me from their cell phones, letting me know what the tallies were before I could even see it on the Bangor Daily News website. I wanted to know from them. So that's happening on election night. We have those informal results that are posted publicly in a variety of ways and accessible to people from all political persuasions. But what happens after the election to verify the vote? We have that list of voters that I mentioned. The number of names that is checked off is matched against the number of ballots for the town. So every single person, whether they vote absentee or in person, has been checked off when a ballot has been issued. And the number of ballots counted for the town has to match the number of names from those people to ensure the accuracy of the results. So when people talk about ballot stuffing, oh, they threw 100 extra ballots into the tabulator, it couldn't happen because that would have to be matched to the number of the names of people who voted in that town. In close races, and all of you who've lived in Maine for a while know this happens all of the time, we have recounts. And one of the reasons Maine was perhaps slower than many states to adopt a post-election audit procedure was because virtually every election that people can remember has generated some sort of recount in a different legislative district. Legislative districts in the north, in the south. We just had a primary election and we had a recount in one district and a ranked choice voting tabulation in another. So in those recounts, those happen at the state level. The procedures are similar. Law enforcement bring the ballots to Augusta. Those ballots are safeguarded. They're under lock and key. Representatives from the campaigns, in fact, the candidates themselves, are invited to be present for those recounts to observe an open and transparent process where representatives from the campaigns themselves are physically the people who are removing the ballots from the ballot box, counting the ballots, reviewing the totals, and checking them. And they have to agree. They have to agree in the ballot totals from every town to check, to verify the results from that town. So we know that time and time again, Maine's recounts have routinely confirmed the results from election night. So those are the checks in vote verification. The overall thing that I wanted to say, and I'll stop here and answer questions, is that we should be so proud. Maine is one of the best states in the nation for election integrity. We have professionals who work hard at the local and the state level to make sure that every single one of us can participate. In 2020, it was 78% of the electorate, almost 79%. Let's get to 80% or 90% or 100%. I think we can do it. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm going to read the questions online for folks watching at home so you can hear the questions and the answers. Thank you. All right. So, first question. People are being bombarded with and spreading alarms that Maine's elections are not secure and saying that states like Texas and Florida have safe elections. What's the elevator speech you suggest people use to respond to these claims? The elevator speech, Maine should be very proud that our elections are free, safe, secure, and accurate. We were third in the nation in 2020. That's the elevator speech. I could go on. And what I do want to say is that unfortunately, we're in an era of disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation is when you hear something, you think it's true, you spread it, you're wrong. It's misinformation, but it's not poorly intended. Disinformation is a lie that is being spread with a malicious intent to undermine voter confidence, perhaps to keep people from voting or to dissuade them from participating in democracy. And malinformation is taking a fact out of context to tell a lie or spread a lie. And we are in an epidemic of disinformation. And the best way to confront disinformation is to learn it for yourself, to volunteer as a poll worker with your municipal clerk. Or if the municipal clerk is full, if they've got poll workers, and we did a great job in June in recruiting poll workers, then call a candidate or call a party and see if they need an observer for a count. When you see it yourself, when you see those checks and balances and the level of accuracy and degree of care that people take, then you believe that our elections, in fact, are free, safe, and secure. Second question. Are there any instances of harassment of poll workers in Maine the way there are in other states? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. In 2021, we saw 2 documented threats against election workers, which were required law enforcement intervention. One of the individuals was prosecuted successfully. One of the individuals was issued a no trespass order. And again, the problem is that when people believe disinformation and malinformation, that can motivate them to threaten or take violent action against the people that are charged with carrying out the elections. And we have not seen it to the degree that other states have seen it. You know, some states have received dozens or hundreds of threats, and it has led to the resignations and retirements of election officials in other states. But we're not immune. Fortunately, under the leadership of Representative Bruce White, we did see protections for election workers pass through the legislature. And it is now a state crime to threaten an election worker or disrupt an election that will be investigated and prosecuted by the Office of the Attorney General. Next question. Could you comment on the difficult aspects of administering a secure system of absentee balloting? So I think what's really important to recognize about absentee balloting is that many of the same safeguards with in-person voting have to exist. And that is verification that the person requesting the absentee ballot is properly registered to vote. And if they're not, then they get issued a voter registration card and they have to show their identity and residency. So some random person can't request an absentee ballot. They need to be a resident of the municipality in which they're making that request, and they need to be able to demonstrate their identity, who they are. And then secondly, so those absentee ballots go out with an envelope that the voter has to sign and then return the ballot in. And that signature needs to match the signature on the voter registration card that the clerk has on file. So if someone pretends to be someone else and signs with a completely different signature, that would be a red flag for the municipal office to know that this isn't the same person. Third, we have an absentee ballot tracking system. And voters can use this too. You can request an absentee ballot online and then watch the process of your request. Now in Maine, we make it as easy as possible to vote. There's a 30-day period prior to the election in which you can cast your ballot. We have no excuse absentee voting. So you can request your ballot now, and in 30 days, just after Indigenous Peoples Day, your ballot will be available. You can look online to see when it is mailed to you. You can fill it out, pop it back in the mail, or drop it at a secure absentee ballot drop box in your town if your town has one. And you can see when that ballot is then retrieved by the clerk's office, and then when it is processed, and then when it is counted. And when those absentee ballots are processed, there are observers from both major political parties present to watch that processing, or at least invited. There are smaller jurisdictions, some with 5 voters. I'm not saying that the Democrats and the Republicans go to the jurisdictions with 5 voters. Maybe they do. But they can. They have that opportunity to do so. They're invited to be there for that processing. And there are always multiple people present for that. And then they're verifying that the envelope, that there's a name on the envelope that matches someone on the voter list, and it's getting checked off on that voter participation history. So those are some of the safeguards. Next question. Some people have expressed concerns about the absentee ballot boxes that may be placed outside town hall, as there is in gray. What procedures are used to maintain the privacy and integrity of these ballots? Again, remember that those ballots have to be in that secure envelope. The clerks can't accept a ballot without a name, right? So they need to either need to be in person so they know that it's you matching this ballot, they're giving the ballot to you, or your ballot needs to be in that secure envelope and signed so that when they're retrieving those ballots, they know who they belong to. That's the security against stuffing an absentee ballot drop box. That's the reason that no one can go photocopy their absentee ballot and then put 100 of them in gray. If they're not in a secure absentee ballot envelope with name and information and that signature, and it's not a verified ballot in a verified envelope from the Secretary of State's office, it will not be counted. Now, could something happen to the ballot drop box? We did have one destroyed by a snowplow. But I will tell you that every single ballot that was in that drop box was undamaged. So, sometimes freak accidents happen, but we can be really proud that our ballot drop boxes are secure. They do need to be in secure locations. They need to be outside of the municipal offices and subject either to regular review by municipal officials or law enforcement or security cameras or both, depending on the municipality. Could the state reschedule its elections to a weekend date rather than a Tuesday? And would that be a good idea? So election day, general election day, is the same all across the country. So no, it used to be that Maine had its election day on September 13th. I'm looking at Ann Gass in the back, who used to head the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women. And we unveiled a marker commemorating suffrage for Maine women together at the State House. And the very first opportunity that women, and let's just be clear, it was unfortunately not all women, because Indigenous women did not get the right to vote until the 1950s. But in 1920, when women were able to cast a ballot in Maine, it was actually on September 13th that they voted. But now there's a uniform election day all across the country. So that would have to take congressional action. Are you an advocate for expanded voting by mail in Maine? So vote by mail is a system that Oregon has, Colorado has, Vermont recently passed. And under that system, they eliminate the absentee ballot request. They simply mail a ballot to every eligible registered voter in the entire state. And then in some states, so Oregon and Washington, you can only return those ballots by mail or by drop box. In other states, you can go on election day. Colorado is one, and you can either vote in person on election day or you can return your ballot. Many academics believe that Colorado's implementation of vote by mail is the reason that it catapulted in front of Maine into number 2 in the last election. It was the first election that they had implemented this statewide. And it certainly does increase that ability to vote for some populations. My brother, who lives in Seattle, said it's wonderful. He and his wife work full time. They have 2 small children. Getting the ballot in the mail, being able to fill it out on their own time and return it through the mail, is just easier than having to remember to go to the polls on election day. So I have always supported vote by mail. Maine law would have to change. Our Constitution would have to change to issue a ballot to everyone without that absentee application in some way, shape, or form. And so that's just something we would need to work on. And advocates certainly have been working on potentially doing that. What's the most alarming and concerning misconception you encounter? I think the most alarming ones are the ones that are rooted in outright disinformation. And as the chief elections official for the state of Maine, I have a security clearance that entitles me to receiving intelligence information about threats from foreign adversaries. And some of the disinformation that is spread by foreign adversaries seeking to undermine American democracy and seeking to undermine the fabric of our society and our unity as a nation. And then seeing that manifest in some of the disinformation that then people believe. And so when we get records requests, and we're seeing a deluge of records requests to the Secretary of State's office and to some local officials, and people say, give me everything about everything in the county. And you're like, yeah, we administer our elections at the municipal level. So your reference to county indicates to me that you got this request from QAnon or Telegram. And it may have had a malicious source, right? Or when people ask for other things that don't exist in Maine law that just show that they are being led astray by people with malintent. That to me is very alarming. And so I just always encourage people, seek out the nonpartisan sources, seek out multiple sources of information. If it sounds too scary or odd or malicious to be true, it probably isn't true. There's a country song that I love, Most People Are Good, and that is true. You know, in Maine, we did have 2 instances of voter fraud in 2020, 2 people who voted twice in the 2020 election. We caught them, we investigated them, we prosecuted them. 2 people out of 828,000. Is there voting or election-related legislation you'd like to see next? Speaker Ryan Fecteau brought forward legislation that I thought was really powerful. It was ongoing absentee voting, permanent ongoing absentee voting, that you could apply to vote absentee and just have that ballot automatically mailed to you in the future. Through a process, it's collaboration, negotiation, compromise in the legislature, that got limited to ongoing absentee voting for seniors and people with disabilities. That will start in the 2024 election. But I would really like to see that apply to more folks. You know, I mentioned my brother, people who are able-bodied, but for one reason or another would prefer to just get that ballot in the mail. I think it should be the voter's choice. Our democracy is grounded in voters' choice, and it should be the people that decide how they want to vote, in what way they want to vote. So that's one thing that I'd like to see, is permanent ongoing absentee voting for all. Speaker Fecteau made a really good start. Do secretaries of state from all states have a national organization or any group that compares practices about voting? I love this question. We do. It's the National Association of Secretaries of State. It is bipartisan. There are secretaries of state represented from almost every state. And we have a number of working committees. And so, for example, I was on a task force to look at best practices for post-election audits and vote verification. It was equal numbers, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans from states, large and small, all across the country. We came up with 10 unanimous recommendations for post-election audits and vote verification. Unanimous. This is Louisiana Secretary of State, the Kansas Secretary of State, both ardent Republicans, the New Mexico Secretary of State, a fellow Democrat, and myself, unanimous in terms of how we should move forward. So those are great conversations that we have. The Kentucky Secretary of State and I co-chaired the Business Services Committee because Secretaries of State oversee corporations in many states. So we worked very closely together on that. The Ohio Secretary of State and I co-chair a national task force on civic health, looking at how we teach civics, how we strengthen our democracy. We've had some great conversations. So next question. We saw you on Public Broadcasting NewsHour. You were great. Thank you. And I am great on public broadcasting too. Right, everybody at home? Did you get other state secretaries calling you with questions after? So I recently did an interview. It was actually an online Zoom panel with the secretaries of state from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Tahisha Wei, she's the first African-American president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, and Lee Chapman of Pennsylvania, a wonderful voting rights attorney. And we had this great conversation about what we do. And Secretary Chapman of Pennsylvania said, Maine has a laundry list of policies that I'd like to see in Pennsylvania. So we do have those conversations all of the time. We share best practices. We learn from each other. And I think that's really important. Is your office experiencing or expecting pressure to change Maine's election and voting processes? This is where everyone should get involved. Vote for people who are pro-democracy. I'm not asking for any partisan advocacy or defeat of any candidates, but evaluate those positions and think about what are the voting practices, what are the election laws that you think are really important and should remain in place. Now, we are very fortunate. We have a strong people's referendum law, and that's how same-day voter registration was preserved. Fun fact, same-day voter registration was introduced and passed by a Republican legislature in 1973, and then upheld by the people and a people's referendum in 2011. Is Maine seeing burdensome questions flooding clerks and election officials happening in other states, apparently coordinated? Yes, we are. We actually just hired an attorney to come into our office a couple of days a week, specifically just to answer those record requests and to help municipalities with them as well, so that our election officials can focus on what they need to focus on, which is preparing for the 2022 election. Because every hour that they're answering somebody asking something absurd, perhaps taken off a QAnon or Telegram message board, is an hour that they don't have for the work that they really need to do. And the last question, regarding the tabulator you mentioned, is it a lease from a specific company? How long is the lease for? Is it renewed with a new administration? And what happens if you change that company, and who could initiate this? Great question. So we do have partners in the private sector who provide some of our voting equipment or some of our systems. So for example, Maine's central voter registration system, which is a central voter file, is older than the iPhone, the first iPhone, the original iPhone. So we're updating it. And we went through a very extended process of procurement. First, we did a request for information. We wanted all of the systems, all of the companies that manufacture voting systems and databases to present their products so we could see what was out there, what functionality, what security. Then we did what's called a request for proposal, an RFP. It had more than 100 criteria that were fundamental to the system: security criteria, accessibility criteria, details on how to manage that system. And then we sent that out and companies bid. We scored those bid and went through every single question to evaluate them, and then awarded that contract, in this case to Stonewall. They're working on our central voter registration system. They did the Rhode Island system. They're doing the Massachusetts system. With the tabulators, the contract is held by a company called ES&S. They do tabulators across the country. Our current lease is just over 10 years old. There are national standards for tabulators set by the federal government. Those standards are in the process of being updated, and we anticipate going out for a new lease in the coming year. But that lease will follow the same criteria of procurement. We'll do an RFP. All of the standards that we expect the equipment to follow will be in that RFP. We'll have a committee of people who will score the RFP. It will go through an approval process at the state level, and then we'll sign that lease. We do a statewide lease for all of our municipalities to avoid any difficulty or any disparities from town to town. We want all the towns to be using the same equipment. Now, that equipment is tested at the state level and at the local level. There are criteria for running those tests so that we can make sure that it's not malfunctioning in any way. And the programming of the ballots itself happens by nonpartisan state election officials and is tested at the state level. We literally take sample ballots. We have people in our elections team fill out those ballots. We fill them out as if they were voting for one candidate. Then we fill them out as they were voting for another candidate. We look at all the permutations and we run the ballots through the machines once they've been programmed to test them. So we test whether the machines are working for different outcomes. And then that's a really important check and balance on the machines. So we do use private sector partners for things the state can't do. I want to close by saying thank you. Thank you for being interested in democracy. Thank you for voting. Oh, is there one more question? Yes, come bring it on up.
Thank you. No, it was mostly answered.
Oh, we can have two questions.
Mine was just about the ranked choice voting.
Oh, ranked choice voting. This is important. I just want to let everybody at home know, under Maine law, we have ranked choice voting in primaries for all the races. But in the general election in November, there is not ranked choice voting for the gubernatorial race or for any state legislative races. That is because the Maine Supreme Judicial Court has ruled that ranked choice voting is not constitutional for the state level races. So for the governor's race, it's a three-way race. We have current Governor Janet Mills, former Governor Paul LePage, independent Sam Hunkler. It is a single choice. Now, for the federal races, the court ruled that is constitutional. So for CD1 and CD2, you will see a ranked choice voting style ballot. It's actually, in most races, it's going to be on the same, it's just going to be on the backside of the gubernatorial ballot. But you will see current Congressman Jared Golden, former Congressman Bruce Poliquin, independent Tiffany Bond, and you will choose 1, 2, or 3, depending on your choices. Or people ask me, does it count if you just mark one? The answer is yes. Other people ask me, what if I really wanted this person and I voted for them for number 1, number 2, and number 3? That'll count too. Like, don't worry, your ballot will count. It will count once. It won't be 3 votes for them. Your ballot counts once, but it will count. And then finally, some secretaries of state are elected and some are appointed and some are elected by the legislature. Maine is one of a few states, New Hampshire and Tennessee are 2 others, where the secretary of state is chosen by the legislature. So the secretary of state is up for re-election every 2 years, but it's an election by the legislature. And that is different from states like neighboring, well, New Hampshire is exactly the same, but Vermont and Massachusetts, the secretaries of state run for office on a statewide ballot, like governor and members of Congress and legislature do here. And in some states, like in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, the secretary of state is actually appointed by the governor. And I have always supported a popular vote for secretary of state. I would be very comfortable being on the ballot, but I also appreciate the legislature's confidence in me and appreciate that very much. It's been a pleasure to be here with all of you. If you are a Maine citizen, a resident here of our state, and you are 18 years of older, you should register to vote. You can do so at any time up and including on Election Day, which is November 8th, 2022. Be one of the 80, 90, 100% of Mainers who vote this year. Thank you very much.